Hey everybody, thanks for joining today's briefing with TargetSmart Senior Advisor Tom Bonnier. Tom's going to go through a short presentation on the latest that he's seeing in the data, and then we will go through questions. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So Tom, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. Thanks everyone for coming. I know everyone's really busy. I know we are, but we did want to take this opportunity to share the latest data we have. Uh, I'll make the presentation part of this relatively brief. I know many of y'all have been joining us over the last few weeks as we've shared these updates along the way. And then, as Jack said, we'll have time for questions, so you can drop them in the Q&A box. So, Sean, if you don't mind sharing the slides, I'm going to go through a handful of slides. I'll do a quick screen share of our Target Early tool just to show a couple elements that we're seeing there in the early vote data. And then again, we'll have time for questions. So, if we can go to the first slide, Sean. So, what I want to do is start with the voter registration as we did in our last briefing, because as we have discussed, when we look at the national environment and we see what, from the polling averages at least, is as close to a 50-50 race as we have seen in quite some time, perhaps ever, the question comes down to turnout, which is somewhat of an obvious statement. Uh, but the good news is we have some indicators of enthusiasm, intensity. We always have to remind ourselves that every poll is based on an educated estimate of who's going to turn out. And those estimates vary, both from pollster to pollster, but sometimes within pollster, when they poll one month and then poll another month, we see movement. Oftentimes what we're seeing, which is interesting to me this year, is actual movement in the composition of the sample from a partisan perspective, rather than specific groups swinging one way or another. So given that, and that we do have evidence, again, we've found, looking at prior elections and the analysis that we've run in previous elections, that some of the best indicators of intensity and enthusiasm are looking at who's registering to vote, at least variations from previous baselines, and then the early vote. Now, both of these analyses come with caveats, and many of you have heard these caveats before. I promise to be brief in explaining those caveats when I go through, but I know some of you are joining us for the first time as well, so I do want to make sure I cover them. But let's start with voter registration data. In our last briefing, we were covering data that was showing new registrants really over the course of this election year compared to 2022 and 2024. What we're going to do a little bit differently in just the next couple of slides here is look at this more isolated period that only looks at new registrants since July 21st of this year. As we know, that's when President Biden withdrew from the race, endorsed Vice President Harris. We've been talking about this a lot, at least earlier in the cycle through August and parts of September, where we were noting that we were seeing these big increases in that immediate week following the candidate change, mainly among women, younger voters, voters of color, in some cases, tripling of registration rates. And again, that was looking at that very narrow period. What we generally see with moments like that is you see very large spikes in new voter registration, and then you'll see the spikes come back down and they'll settle at a new level, generally in these cases above the level they were at before. So those who are most engaged by whatever the moment is that they're reacting to, in this case, the candidate change, are more likely to take action in the immediate few days, but then you'll see others following suit. The reason that this is relevant in the context of this analysis and next Tuesday is that we know historically that when groups show higher registration rates in this lead up to the election, that those groups writ large tend to have higher turnout, meaning not just the new registrants, but the general representatives of those demographic segments. And so the other element that we're considering here is that these new registrants are just incredibly likely to vote. If you look at 2020 and you look at people who registered in the last 3 months of the election cycle, 83% of them cast a ballot. In a way that almost deflates the saliency of that number, because we know that many of the people who are registering are people who weren't intending to register. They're people who are in an automatic voter registration state, perhaps, and they just registered to vote as they got their driver's license or some other government interaction. That's why we look at the spikes and the variations compared to year. So with those caveats out of the way in that context, again, you all have seen this slide in front of you for the last few minutes, so I'm not going to read it for you. But what I will do is just share highlights from the partisan perspective, just so you understand exactly what these numbers mean. What this is saying when we look at model partisanship, and again, this is limited just to the battleground states at this point. We have the data across the country, of course, but for the sake of this conversation, we're going to be looking at these 7 battleground states. And what we saw since July 21st is that the share of people who are registering to vote that were modeled as Democrats across these states was 16 points higher than the share who were identified as Republicans. Again, you see that comparison to 2020, where if you look at that same period in time, late July up through mid-October, and you look at new registrants in those same states, it was actually dead even in that time period. You had a roughly equal number of Republicans and Democrats registering to vote. So this is a significant swing. Anticipating a question here, when we look at partisan registration, we know, especially in many of these battleground states, I'll say, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, you can throw Pennsylvania in there too, to a lesser extent. These are all partisan registration states where unaffiliated voters have become a much larger share of new registrants. In many of these states, a majority of new registrants in the past year. A lot of that is automatic voter registration. We know the default in many of these states is unaffiliated. We also know these unaffiliated voters are overwhelmingly younger, and they're more likely to be voters of color. We know from polling that these young unaffiliated voters still lean heavily Democratic and are much more likely to support Vice President Harris. So it's why you see perhaps some of this distinction. From a race and ethnicity perspective, you do see increases among voters of color registering to vote. Both among African American, Latino, and Asian American voters. Why don't we go to the next slide? Gender gap. We know that probably all of us are paying a lot of attention to turnout in terms of gender, especially in this post-Dobbs environment that we're in. We know that since the Dobbs decision and the limited set of elections we've had to analyze, we've seen large overperformance in turnout from women voters. Really, 2 ends of the age spectrum: younger women voters and older women voters. And so, again, looking at this voter registration trend is important. And what you see is consistent with what we've been seeing post Dobbs, in that women are out registering men by a larger margin than they did during the same time period in 2020. And if you drill down a little bit further, again, consistent with what we were seeing in that immediate week after Vice President Harris became the nominee, you're seeing even larger increases in registration among women of color, again, especially younger women of color, highlighting Georgia and North Carolina here specifically, where you're seeing that to a substantial extent. Big registration, new registration numbers. And keep in mind, Georgia is one of those states that has a very effective automatic voter registration program. So there's a much smaller unregistered population. So to see these sorts of shifts in this type of narrow time period is somewhat unusual. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that's the voter registration data. Very quickly, I'm going to get into some early vote turnout. Again, I've got 2 slides here. I think I'll show you a couple of things on the Target Early site, and then I'll be happy to take questions if you want to put them in the Q&A box. So this is a question we've seen a lot around the early vote data. And if I can take a quick step back, and this is the caveat section. So for those of you who've heard this, you can tune out for the next minute or so. But context is everything in early vote analysis. In the end, it's not especially important or interesting to look at the early vote data and say which side is, quote, winning, turning out more of their voters. Certainly, there's some tactical advantage to campaigns to banking votes and getting voters out of the way. But what we're looking for in early vote data is signs of intensity and enthusiasm. Because again, it's correlated generally with election day turnout. It can give us a sense in this environment where the polls are showing an incredibly close race who might have the advantage in turnout. In the important context here, as we all know, generally to draw that type of conclusion, we would compare to the previous presidential election. The problem with that is obvious. 2020 was a pandemic election. Democrats were much more likely to vote early because they were much more COVID conscious. And frankly, on the flip side of the coin, Donald Trump convinced his supporters that mail voting was a form of fraud. So what we saw happen was a major pivot from mail voting being something that Republicans once dominated, especially in many of these Sunbelt states, to something that in some of these states was providing a 3-1 or at least a 2-1 margin for President Biden and Democratic candidates, as Republicans really shifted much more to election day voting. They did do more early in person voting than they did mail voting, but again, Republicans were overwhelmingly more likely to vote on election day. What we've seen in the 4 years since then are three important changes in ballot access, in many states actually making early vote at least somewhat more restrictive. Think about Georgia, where the vote by mail requests became more restrictive. Instead of everyone getting a vote by mail request, you had to request it. You had a shorter period of time in order to request it, a shorter period of time in order to return your ballot, and you had stricter signature requirements. But there are states like Michigan that actually expanded early voting, in this case, adding early in person, which, as I said a moment ago, is actually something that's generally, while the partisanship is generally more likely to be 50-50 split, depending on the state, it's more favorable for Republicans than mail voting. So you have those changes, which make the sort of contextual comparisons difficult. You have the fact that Democrats were more likely to shift back to election day. We know in 2020, 2/3 of all voters, all votes were cast before election day. By 2022, that went down to 46%. If you look at the polling now and you look at the data we have, which is a very large set of early vote data that has been collected already, we believe the early vote turnout will be somewhere between 50 to 55% of all votes cast. So when you go from 2/3 to about half, that means a lot of people who voted early 4 years ago are likely to vote on election day this time around. When you look at the polling data, and I'm sharing some of this here, you see that those people, the vote mode shifters going from early to election day, are overwhelmingly younger voters and voters of color, traditionally Democratic audiences. Conversely, we have Republicans actually now contesting the early vote. If you watch the Madison Square Garden rally, or frankly any Trump rally in recent weeks, you've seen almost every speaker promote voting early, even Donald Trump himself telling his supporters that they should vote however they're comfortable. So what that means is our comparisons to 2020 are somewhat fraught, but we still can learn something about the early vote. And I'm going to show you something on the website in a minute. But I did want to take this on. We've heard this, and some folks have been looking at this and saying, well, are we as Democrats concerned about Black voter turnout in North Carolina or Georgia or some of these other states? Because when you look at the early vote share, Black voters are accounting for a smaller share of the early vote than they did at this point 4 years ago. And my answer to this is no. This was expected, and what I'll do is confirm it here with polling. And so you look at the Marist poll, and this is a great example, and I appreciate that they broke the data out as they did here, though frankly you can find a number of polls that show the same thing. They asked the question of, has someone voted already? If so, how? Or if not, do they intend to vote on election day? And you can make comparisons in here by race. And what they found was that 35% of likely Black voters in the state of North Carolina say they intend to vote in person on election day, whereas only 26% of white voters intend to do the same. That's a big shift from 2020. And so when you look at that, you can just do some simple math based on the early vote that has been cast already in North Carolina, and then apply these projections that if you assume that the early vote equals 65% of the turnout for Black voters and 74% of the turnout for white voters, it actually projects to Black voters increasing their share of the electorate over 2020. Narrowly, but still an increase, which I would take as a good sign, given that this is, again, a likely voter poll, and they're not really in the end making any assumptions over what will happen on election day. So there's the potential for these numbers to be bigger. You see the white vote share declining. So if anything, this is potentially troubling for Republicans in terms of seeing that likely shift. I put together some numbers I shared on X or Twitter just a few moments before this call, but I looked at something similar for Georgia and found an even more stark comparison. In Marist, they asked the same question the same way in Georgia. If you look at it broken down by age, and for younger voters, they only go down to age 35 or younger, but they found that 38% of voters under the age of 35 in Georgia intend to vote on election day. If you look at seniors over age 65, it's about, and it's on my Twitter account. You can look at it. It was somewhere between 13 to 15% of seniors intend to vote on election day. So that gap isn't surprising. We know older voters are much more likely to vote uh, early, especially by mail. But if you look at the breakdown from 2020, those numbers would represent a 10% margin shift, meaning 28% of young voters voted on election day. So it's going from 28% to 38%. Whereas for older voters, it was only about a 3-point margin shift. So again, what you're seeing in the early vote data is this sort of anticipated vote mode shift where traditionally Republican voters, especially Republican seniors, white voters, are either maintaining their early vote behavior or actually moving to more of them voting early, whereas traditionally Democratic voters, younger voters, voters of color, are much more likely to want to go out and cast their ballot on election day. If we can go to the last slide here, Sean, I believe it's the last slide. And so this sort of hammers this point home just in terms of the numbers. This vote mode shifting that I'm talking about, if you look at the breakdown in North Carolina by race, and you look at the white voters who have cast a ballot early, 300,000 of them cast their ballot on election day 4 years ago and are now voting early. Pennsylvania is perhaps the most stark comparison at this point. Whereas in Pennsylvania, you look at the Republicans, and no doubt in Pennsylvania, there has been a shift where Republicans have increased their share of the early vote right now compared to where it was 4 years ago. But when we look at how they did that, what was the composition of the early vote? That's what really stands out to me in terms of this vote mode shifting. And that 46% of the registered Republicans who have voted already in Pennsylvania were just mail voters last time around. They're just doing the same thing again. They did mail last time around. They apparently liked it. They're coming back and doing it again. We do know that Republicans who voted early, especially by mail 4 years ago, were actually much more likely to cross over and vote for President Biden. Whether or not that is the case this time around, we can talk about that in the Q&A, perhaps. There's some evidence of that, but that's still an open question. 48% of the registered Republicans who have voted by mail already voted on election day. So you do that simple math, that adds up to about 94% of all Republicans who voted in Pennsylvania so far voted in 2020. So how did they create an increase? It wasn't by producing new votes. It was by just shifting people who were voting anyhow on election day and bringing them out early. Okay. Thank you for that, Sean. I'm going to share my screen just very quickly here. I went on longer than I intended, but I do want to just show the Target Early tool. For those of you who haven't seen this before, you can go to targetsmart.com, or you can just go to targetsmart.com and you can find it there. This is updated twice a day. The latest update for today hasn't gone through yet. It'll go through in a few hours. But this is basically real-time early vote data matched into our voter file. So you have a whole lot of demographic and partisan information, and you have comparisons to the same point in 2022. In 2020, you have the ability to look at different points in time in terms of how many days out from the election. You can look at the total early vote from the previous elections, and you can even look at the total overall turnout, including election day turnout. You can look at different aggregates or states. For this just quick thing I want to show you here, We're going to look at the aggregate of the 7 battleground states and look at modeled partisanship. So everything that I just mentioned to you in terms of the caveats, noting that more Republicans are shifting. And by the way, I'll share the numbers for Pennsylvania so I can actually show you. It's probably a good example. But with all those caveats and everything we expected to see happening with Republicans shifting, we've heard a lot of talk about how Republicans say that they're happy with what they're seeing in the early vote. Well, when you look at the modeled partisanship of where we are across the battleground states at this point, again, you see number one, just this overall reduction in the early vote. That's the first validation of what we were talking about, that early vote isn't going to be as big of a share of the overall vote as it was 4 years ago. Again, we anticipated that. I don't think anyone would contest that. But in the end, when we're talking about the early vote data, sometimes people are saying, well, Republicans are surging in early vote or another group surging. In reality, every group is actually just declining in early vote relative to 4 years ago. It's just a question of which groups have declined more. Um, you see the total turnout right now just under 14 million in the battleground states. And again, this will get updated later today, so that number will go up. But when you look at the modeled partisanship, what we see is actually very minimal differences. The model Democratic advantage, and again, this is not predicting candidate support, this is a proxy for partisan registration, think of it that way, was 2.2 points. If you look at where it is now, we're at 1.8 points. So you're seeing about a 4/10 of a point shift net to Republicans in the margin. So it's happening. There is a shift, but certainly nowhere to the extent, and I certainly can't speak for Republicans in terms of what they anticipated, but if we listen to what they were saying beforehand and we look at what we were anticipating from a Democratic perspective, we certainly anticipated bigger shifts towards Republicans than this. Why aren't those shifts as big? I mean, beyond the strategic questions, which I can't answer in terms of the efficacy of the Republican effort, you're seeing more Democratic seniors coming out, especially more Democratic senior women. And that is, in some ways, blunting these Republican efforts. The youth gender gaps in many of these states are actually bigger, though we know younger voters are still much more likely to come out on election day. So I'm going to show you one last thing here, and then we'll take questions because I've gone on too long. But I wanted to show you that Pennsylvania thing that I was talking about. And for those of you who haven't seen this before, can see how this works. And so when we look at Pennsylvania, here's the cool thing we can do. We can toggle this on and look at Republicans. In this case, we'll look at registered party since they have it there. And what we see is that among the registered Republicans who have cast a ballot already in Pennsylvania, here it is, 48% of them voted on election day. So many of you are probably wondering, okay, fine, but what is that for Democrats? It's just 14%. So Democrats aren't cannibalizing a lot of these election day votes. And in fact, what we can do is look at this slightly differently, where we can look at 2020 vote mode and look at those people in Pennsylvania who have voted already but weren't registered to vote last time around. We've heard Republicans, including Elon Musk, brag about Republican registration efforts in Pennsylvania over the last 4 years. But what you see is Democrats are still leading even among these new registrants, where they still have a 12-point advantage in terms of early vote share, even among these voters. So that was a lot. I'm going to stop here, and I'd love to take anyone's questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. And like we said, feel free to go ahead and put any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. The first one is on Wisconsin. With Harris and Trump both in the state today, can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing there, especially in terms of early voting?
Yeah, so there are two states that really, over the arc of early voting, which now has been a few weeks in most states, including Wisconsin, have surprised me in that they've really bucked the trend that I've been talking about, where we've been talking about in many of these states, at least a slight trend towards Republicans in terms of vote share. And again, that's based on vote cannibalization, but it still exists. From the beginning, we've seen such strong turnout from likely Democratic voters in Michigan and Wisconsin that the early vote there has actually been, again, apparently more Democratic than it was at the same point in 2020, even though the patterns are different. I'm being careful here and using the word apparently for a reason. Michigan and Wisconsin are two states that don't have partisan registration. So again, we're relying on modeled partisanship. And while our team does an incredible job in building these partisan models, any partisan model is just that. It is a model. It is fallible. It is not built for this specific intent. It is built to rank order voters on probability of partisanship, of which it does a very good job. But again, when you also look at the demographic indicators of who has voted early in Wisconsin, and again, we can add in Michigan, the numbers look quite good for Democrats at this point. Since I've brought Michigan into the conversation, I'll just at least add the caveat there that, as I mentioned at the outset of this briefing, Michigan is one of those states that added more ways for people to vote early, including early in person. And as I said, that's a vote mode that has been more favorable for Republicans. And so you have seen the Democratic margins in Michigan come down since then, but still with very strong margins. You've also seen, by the way, in Wisconsin, very big gender gaps where women are turning out at a much higher rate than men in the early vote. And again, in the first couple of weeks of the early vote, they were actually outpacing 2020 numbers, which is surprising.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Next question. What do you think might be motivating these voters of color to shift back to voting on election day?
Well, it's difficult to speak to motivational elements of this, given that it doesn't show up in the early vote data, and the polling hasn't dug into it. Certainly from some of the theories I've seen out there, one of which I can speak to myself, and I hate to admit this, but I'm someone who voted early 4 years ago who plans to vote on election day. And I know, look, I'm a big believer in people casting their ballot before election day. Get it out of the way, make sure it's in, and don't leave anything to chance. I think a lot of people just like the excitement and enthusiasm of going out to participate in this day. And I think we've heard this especially from voters of color, and the potentially historical nature of this election and sort of participating in that singular moment on election day. I've even just seen that in my responses on Twitter as I've shared some of these stats as many people, and you can see that, click on those tweets and see it for yourself. Just many people responding and saying that's what I'm doing. And so I think that's a big element of it. And then also just remembering that a lot of people are just reverting to their pre-pandemic behavior. And so again, in many of these states, the early vote prior to 2020, if it wasn't dominated by Republicans, Republicans had a substantial advantage. It tended to be older and whiter. And so, that's an element in some of these states where people are just reverting. The pandemic was an outlier. We also have to remember it also impacted college students more than most. It wasn't uncommon for college students to be registered to vote where they were enrolled in university, and that might be a different state from where they live. Many of them went home to live with their parents during those first several months of the pandemic. They were in virtual classes that fall, and so they had no choice but to vote by mail. And so it's not surprising to see a difference there in these numbers.
Great. What are your thoughts when you see the recent polling that shows Harris with wide margins among those who have already voted, alongside what you already know about the shifts and who is voting early?
So this is a fascinating question to me. And so many of you have probably seen this. When we look at the polling, most pollsters at this point are doing something that I very much appreciate, which is, yes, they've got the likely voter model, which almost every poll now is a likely voter model where it's the pollster's best estimate of who's going to vote. But then they're adding in, which is something I was leveraging for that analysis in North Carolina and Georgia that I was alluding to in the PowerPoint presentation, where they're including a crosstab in the poll of whether or not someone's voted already and by how. And what you've seen, and really it's been about a week and a half since we began to see these numbers released in polls, is Vice President Harris has had a fairly consistent commanding lead in the national numbers among those who have voted already, but now also state by state. And when you line those up with the partisanship that we know to be the case from the data that I just shared. We know who voted. We don't know for whom, but we know the generic partisanship, whether that's modeled or party registration. quite consistently, Vice President Harris's polling numbers are outperforming the known partisanship of these audiences. So there's two possible explanations for this broadly, and the answer could be somewhere between the two. It likely is. But one, the poll could just be missampling these voters. They could be taking in too many Democratic early voters. We don't see in the sample what the composition is in terms of how many registered Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated there are. Now, the reason that I'm not confident that that is the case is number one, just the scale and the scope of it. It's every poll at this point is showing something very similar. But two, unlike a likely voter audience where the pollster has to make an educated estimate of turnout, which is a very challenging thing to do, this is a known audience. We have this on our website, but any pollster who's pulling a voter file sample, which is most pollsters at this point, has the ability to weight this component of their sample directly to the known turnout. So there's no real reason that their poll should be overly weighted towards Democratic early voters. So that leaves us with the explanation that Vice President Harris is outperforming generic partisanship, perhaps doing better with Democrats, though we know core partisans in polls seem to be quite polarized. As I said before, we know that in 2020, Republicans who voted before Election Day were more likely to vote for President Biden. We may see that continuing at this point. We looked at the early vote in Pennsylvania and found that 30% of the registered Republicans who have voted already in Pennsylvania voted in the presidential primary there. We know that Nikki Haley did especially well with early voters in that primary in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So we could just be seeing more of a crossover, and we could be seeing Vice President Harris performing very well with unaffiliated and independents, which frankly is something we've been predicting for quite some time now for various reasons. Like I said, those who are registered unaffiliated are much more likely to be younger and voters of color than they were 4 years ago. That's a big part of it.
There's been a lot of focus on young male voters at the end of this election cycle. Do you have any indication of their turnout so far?
Well, we know that the theory of the case, or at least one of the theories of the case for the Trump campaign this time around, when they say, well, look, how do we go from an electorate where we lost by 7 million votes 4 years ago to one that we can prevail in? And one of the main arguments they've made in terms of their ability to change the electorate is that they're going to bring in more of these young men, especially young white men, but not exclusively, some young men of color. We've seen that reflected in the campaign strategy. Joe Rogan, these various other podcasts, UFC, so on and so forth. And so all I can say at this point is that we're not seeing it in the early vote data. We're actually, as I said, in many of these states, you're actually seeing bigger gender gaps where women are accounting for a larger share of the early vote among younger voters than at this point in 2020, which is again somewhat surprising. It doesn't mean that they can't get a surge of turnout among these younger men on election day. It's certainly possible, as I've been saying. We expect younger voters to vote much more heavily on election day, but we can say that we're not seeing it yet in this data.
Shifting gears a little bit, what percentage of turnout this cycle will be, those new registrants?
It's a great question. It's something that's answerable, and I don't know off the top of my head. But we've seen in 2020, it was a fairly, I believe, it was in the double digits, or at least first time voters were in the double digits. You can actually look at the Target Early site, and if you look at the final election, there's a breakdown there where you can look at first time voters. And so I want to say it was somewhere around 12 or 13% of the electorate. So it's not an insignificant share of the electorate. I think initially in this election, we were expecting first time voters and new registrants to be a much smaller share of the electorate. One, when you're coming off the heels of a very high turnout election, which 2016 was, it was a record high, both in terms of raw turnout, but in terms of eligible population, it was also a very high turnout. It just means there are fewer unregistered voters to pull from, or non-voters to pull from. Certainly prior to July 21st, we were seeing a general lack of enthusiasm in the electorate in the polling, where I think most Americans weren't very excited about the idea of a rematch. And we've seen that change. I mentioned the voter registration numbers since July 21st. We went over some of those. So I think those numbers are at least in play at this point where we might see a larger share of new registrants, first time voters. I don't know that we'll get to that 2020 level, but certainly larger than anyone would have anticipated 4 months ago.
Thanks, Tom. Can you speak to some of the Democratic concern about Republican gains with white male registration, specifically in Arizona?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is somewhat misleading. Again, I remind people when they see these somewhat viral tweets where they'll include, and it's Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Generally, you'll see that Florida to some extent, where you'll see Republican accounts sharing these numbers, and they'll show the Democratic number of registrations, number of registered Democrats, number of registered Republicans over the last 4 years. And absolutely, you are seeing increases in number of registered Republicans. So the gaps have been changing in a way that has been favorable to Republicans. I don't contest that, but to me, North Carolina is a great example of this. Summer of 2020, Republicans were 30% of all registered voters. Summer of 2024, Republicans were 29.8% of registered voters. The gap between Democrats and Republicans became more favorable to Republicans over that 4 year period, and that's what Republicans have been talking about. What they're ignoring in that chart and in their analysis is the fact that unaffiliated voters have increased substantially. And so, no doubt, Republicans have made gains. I've talked about this over the last couple of years. When you look at the partisan registration trends, there are bigger gender gaps with voters under the age of 25, specifically young white voters, than we see among any other group, where young white women have actually become substantially more democratic and progressive. Young white men have gone in the opposite direction. So that in the end brings us back to the last answer that, will we see? There's a reason that we've seen the Trump campaign emphasizing their potential with this vote. Will we see these young white men engaging at a higher rate? There's not evidence of that yet, but that could happen. There is evidence, ample evidence, since the Dobbs decision that young women, including young white women, but also very much including young women of color, are highly engaged. I've talked about this endlessly, but in Kansas, in that first test of the Dobbs decision in that August election, that state constitutional amendment there, uh, women under the age of 25 in Kansas turned out at a higher rate than all men of any age. So we know that young women are engaged. It'll be a question about young men that'll be answered in, I guess, 4 days.
Thanks, Tom. I saw in the early vote tracker that about 9% of the people that have cast a vote in 2024 so far did not vote in 2020. What can you tell us about this group?
So that's a group that's similar to, I showed you, then, oh, maybe I didn't show you, but we talked about this so much. When we look at the people who have registered since 2020 in the battleground, I showed you that modeled partisanship number where Democrats have a narrow modeled party advantage among all people have voted already in the battleground states. If we limit that universe to just the people who have voted already who weren't registered to vote 4 years ago, the Democratic margin actually doubles. So again, the Republican theory of the case is that they're going to bring in more of these new voters. It's surprising to see these new registrants being more Democratic. Now, the question that was asked is slightly different because now we're expanding to anyone who didn't vote in 2020, which would include people who were registered to vote, but failed to vote in 2020. That's a very small share of the electorate right now. That is more Republican than the new registrant audience, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. That makes sense. Again, given that Democrats won the popular vote by about 7 million votes 4 years ago, there are just more Republican non-voters because Republican turnout wasn't as good. But again, you're not seeing a big surge and you're not seeing big Republican advantages among these non-2020 voters.
Thanks, Tom. What explains how the gender gap in this year's early vote is different than the gender gap in early vote previous years?
Yeah, it's an important question. I spent a lot of time looking at the gender gap. We talked about that in the context of voter registration. In terms of early vote, like I said, early on, Michigan, Wisconsin, some of these other battleground states, you were actually seeing bigger gender gaps in 2020, which was honestly shocking to me. Again, given everything that we've anticipated with Republicans pushing more early vote and then more younger voters and voters of color pushing to election day, and the gender gaps were so big in the early vote in 2020 because Republicans were generally avoiding the early voting. We're talking about across the battlegrounds, really, with the exception of Nevada, which it's an overwhelmingly male state. Outside of Nevada and to some extent Arizona and the other five battleground states, seeing gender gaps between 10 to 12 points. What we're seeing in the early vote now with the gender gap, when you look across all ages, is that they're very close. We're generally seeing a difference where the share of women voting is slightly reduced from 2020, but generally somewhere within a tenth to 4/10 of a point drop off, which is minimal. Again, especially given that context of the high numbers in 2020 that we're comparing to and the expectation that Republicans would be coming out in bigger numbers. When you look at it broken down by age, it's instructive to me because among voters over the age of 50, early voters over the age of 50, the gender gaps are actually generally identical to 2020. In some cases, especially as we get older, age 75 and higher, the gender gaps in many of these states are actually bigger than they were at this point in 2020. So the reason that the gender gaps are slightly smaller overall in some of these states is among the sort of, it's not the youngest voters, but think of those between say age 35 to 50 where the gender gaps aren't as big. And again, that makes sense. I shared the Marist data. You can look at this in other polls and just our expectation going in that younger voters, especially younger women, are more likely to come out on election day.
This is a polling question. Do you think that new registrants have been undercounted or underweighted in the polls, particularly that surge of young women of color?
No one knows. First of all, we'll find out next week. But we do have to keep in mind that, as I've said before, every poll we look at is a likely voter model. It's a pollster's estimation of turnout. What we can definitively say, because the polls do, um, we can look at the crosstabs and see what percent of their likely voter sample is men versus women. And there is no evidence of any pollsters out there, frankly, creating a likely voter sample where they're assuming any sort of substantial expansion in women and their share of the electorate. We know that women in general historically account for a larger share of the electorate than men, both because of turnout and because women live longer. And so you see that reflected. But if you look at these polls, they generally are hewing right to the 2020 gender differentials. Now, I think a lot of people would argue that since Dobbs, that's changed. If you look at the states where abortion rights was more salient just in terms of being present, think about Michigan in 2022, where it was literally on the ballot, but you also had an incumbent governor who was very much running on the issue. You saw the gender gaps really go out in 2022 relative to prior midterms, bigger gender gaps. So there is an argument to be made that the polls at this point are underestimating turnout from women, in this case, more likely turnout from younger women. If we see a surprisingly good result for Vice President Harris and Democrats on election night, I would bet good money today that it's based on that dynamic, that the polls aren't accounting for that type of surge. And to be clear, I'm not being critical of the pollsters for not predicting higher turnout from any specific group. It's a fairly safe place to be to look at the last election and account for population changes, adjust for population changes, and then create a likely voter model that looks like that. That's fairly transparent. But then again, we as analysts and political observers can look at the evidence before us and see what happened in Dobbs. I think there's a reason why Democrats have fairly consistently outperformed the polls since June 24th, 2022. And it's been because of this dynamic. Some might argue that that's different because all of these elections we've seen so far have been lower turnout elections, midterms, special elections, primaries, and that in a presidential election, turnout is higher. So there's less of a potential for that impact. I'm not sure that's correct, but that's one of the theories. And so, again, it's certainly something that I think has the potential to have the biggest impact, and for our sort of collective understanding of this electorate and the likely outcome of this election to be wrong come Tuesday.
Have you seen a shift in the Latino vote in Pennsylvania post MSG rally on Sunday?
So we don't have any great indicators of that at this point. I mean, again, we actually could look at the early vote data and see if there's an increase. And now that someone asked that question, that's a genius idea, and I'm going to look at that, and I'll share it on Twitter or wherever else. Um, uh, certainly that's something that Pennsylvania. So our team, and credit to our team who does incredible things, by the way, if that's not already obvious, all this data, all this analysis, none of it's possible without the incredible work they do. And they've done something cool where they're able to identify Puerto Rican registered voters in the continental US just over the last handful of days. And they found over 300,000 such registered voters in Pennsylvania, over 600,000 in Florida. And so, yeah, we'll take a closer look at these voters and see if we've seen any increase. In Pennsylvania, I think it's less likely that we'd be seeing an increase at this moment just because Pennsylvania is basically exclusively vote by mail. Yes, you can go to an election office and file your mail application and vote there in person, but that's a very small share of all the votes there. Florida might be interesting to look at. Obviously, not in that sort of top tier 7 presidential battleground state, but still a lot going on there and real operations in terms of turnout. So we'll take a look. We'll certainly circle back if we find anything interesting.
Thanks, Tom. And then we have time for one last question, I think. So, in terms of encouraging demographic trends in the early vote, are these primarily driven by model Democratic women and voters of color?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you're seeing it depends really. Like I said, in some cases you're seeing Democratic women, senior women, turning out at much higher rates, which I've, one of the theories I've heard there is that that's connected to Dobbs. It makes sense to me anecdotally. The case that's been made to me is that these are women who lived and remember a pre-Roe America, and so they are especially motivated and mobilized in this election. We are seeing them turn out at a higher than expected rate. And in many cases, a higher rate just in terms, I said at the outset how turnout has sort of dropped everywhere relative to 2020. This would be one of the caveats where you've actually in some of these states seen more senior Democratic women vote already than voted at this point in 2020. In some states, again, as I said, you are seeing some of these numbers outpaced with younger voters of color, even though from a share perspective, overwhelmingly, they're shifting back to election day. So there's a diversity in the Democratic coalition like there always is. And you're seeing some uneven performance between states in terms of who is driving this surprising overperformance for Democrats.
Great. I think that's all we have for today. Thanks everybody for joining, and be sure to follow along with Tom in these next few days. I'm sure he'll have plenty of analysis for you all to stay in touch with.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everybody.